So good afternoon, everybody. I think it's probably time we can make a start here. Welcome everybody who's joining us. My name is Michael Newman. I'm the Chief Executive of the AJR. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all, to see you all. We're battling many things at the moment, including the promised thunderstorm that has been talked about. So we might have a little bit of interruption, but we'll see how we get along. It's a great pleasure to welcome as our speaker, my interlocutor this afternoon, Barbara Winton. Welcome, Barbara. It's very nice to see you. Just before we get going with our chat, with our conversation, just to remind everybody, of course, that the work of the AJR has continued slightly differently during these past few weeks, and we've been delighted to organise a number of Zoom events like the one this afternoon. And of course, we've continued to make sure that our primary service, our primary role, which is the delivery of the social welfare services, continued, especially during the worst of the crisis. And so just a reminder, as ever, if there is anybody who you know who could benefit from our services, particularly the work of the social workers, the financial assistants, our volunteer services, then please do let us know. We have, in the last couple of weeks, gradually reopening our work, so we're trying to get back to some kind of normality. But we're very conscious of the impact that the lockdown is having, particularly on our members, and so we would like to hear from anyone who feels that they could benefit from our services or needs any assistance. So during the lockdown, we've been able to present a number of fascinating and illuminating events, a whole range of engaging speakers, and including, I'm dare to say, this afternoon with Barbara, who's a long-standing friend of the AJR, spoken at a number of our events and to our members, and who will, of course, be particularly known to those of our members with a Czech connection. And so it's a real great pleasure to welcome Barbara again. And I'm conscious that as we do so, that it's in this period at this time in the year, as we move towards the anniversary of the 1st September, of course, then the 3rd September, the outbreak of war. A few months ago, we commemorated the 75th anniversary of the end of the war. We always seem to be not too far from one anniversary or another, and it's somehow particularly poignant and relevant today to mention also that the podcast series that my colleague Alex Moores has been working on the Kindertransport, the final episode, which features an excerpt from Barbara, is now available, which completes the series. You can download this episode, and you can find all previous episodes via the AJR website. So please do have a listen. We would really love your feedback. And so doing, I should also add my congratulations to Alex for putting the series together. So Barbara, welcome along. It's very nice to see you. I know
Great to be here.
A lot of our members will, of course, know you from seeing you on the stage and delivering one of your impassioned speeches in the past. And said it's very nice of you to come along and join us today. I suppose the main question people have when they see you is about the whole span of the 80-year period between the work of your father and then the work that you're doing today. And of course, I think it'd be interesting to also capture today the impact that the current crisis is having, particularly on refugee crisis. It's been a little bit more in the news the last couple of days, but it seemed to have been overshadowed for a long time, of course, because of the pandemic. So maybe let's start with the very sort of latest information. There's been a couple of reports recently, and the government's, I saw one particular spat where Priti Patel got into an argument with Ben and Jerry's. I don't know if you saw that one.
Yes.
Over some comments they made. But how do you see the current situation affecting migrants coming to Britain, and the current climate?
Well, I'm a bit worried that I might get a bit ranty and sweary on this.
Well, that's why we've got you on, you see.
Okay, well, apologies if I offend anybody in advance. I mean, my feeling about what's happening at the moment is because the government is closing down the safe and legal routes that are established between Europe and the UK as part of the EU, which allows for transfers of asylum seekers and refugees across Europe. Because that's being closed down, people are getting very desperate and trying to get across while they still can. And obviously the government response to that is the knee-jerk anti-immigration response that they feel is the way the public wants them to behave based on the Brexit referendum. And the kind of the knee-jerk invasion, swarms, all these things that have been talked of for the last, well, 5 years really, since the beginning of the serious refugee crisis. It's very easy for them to slot back into that because they believe that is popular and that is what people want from them. I think the media have a hand in that, and there's been some disgraceful media input of boats chasing these poor people coming across in these dinghies as if they are some kind of spectator sport. And that hasn't helped, I don't think, either. Yeah. So I think the government have brought this situation on themselves. Not only that, they are using it now as a way of distracting from the major issues that are facing our country, as I believe, especially their response to COVID, by what's called in political circles throwing a dead cat onto the table. And they do that by going, I know we've got all these issues, but look over there, that's where the problem is. And a few hundred people coming across on dinghies suddenly becomes the main focus of everybody's attention. And they're very good at doing that. They've been doing that for many years and looking for a scapegoat. And I guess it's happened through history, as we know, that it's easy to find a scapegoat from outside one's own community and point at them as the reasons why we're all suffering. And here we go again.
But if we're reading the history of your father's role and his work, and particularly, I mean, we'll come specifically onto his work a bit later on, but the attitude that he was facing when he was trying to bring over the children from Czechoslovakia, what you've just described seems to have been a similar kind of attitude here about bringing people in, and not, I mean, it was very difficult to get permissions, to get guarantees, to persuade the governments of the day to allow people to find refuge here. And so you talk about 5 years, but in some sense, this is 80 years or even longer. And so is that just innate to this? Is it Britain? Is it British culture? Is it something phenomenon in other countries as well, do you think? I mean, how do we respond to this?
I think it's probably, well, I don't know because I don't know about the whole world, but I would say in the Western world, it's not terribly unusual. This idea that, people are going to come and take from us. And, we're all struggling with our lives, and where are we going to find a scapegoat? And it used to be no blacks, no Irish, no dogs, and now it's no Syrians, no Afghans, no Somalis. So it's always looking for somebody outside of ourselves who is causing our problems. And you're absolutely right. Back in the 1930s, there were many people, including some of the same media who today are scapegoating refugees, were scapegoating Jewish refugees then and saying we don't want them in our country. And the British Union of Fascists was very popular, and many of the newspapers supported their perspective. So yes, in a sense, there is no difference. the problem that we have, in a sense, is that Britain has adopted this kind of heroic history of how wonderful and tolerant we were back then as the truth, as the single truth, two-dimensional truth of the situation, and forgotten that actually it was a lot more complex and wasn't quite so straightforward, and getting refugees to be allowed to enter the country was quite complex, and some of the groups who you would have expected maybe to be helpful perhaps weren't always as helpful as they might have been, and that seems to go on.
Yeah, I read one of your quotes from the other day. I'll just read it because it seems to be entirely appropriate to this conversation, as inevitably. It's amazing to realise that, and then you name Boris Johnson, Dominic Raab, Priti Patel, Rishi Sunak, Sajid Javid, are all in the UK due to refugee or migrant parents, grandparents, great-grandparents. What they benefit from, they wish to deny others. So do you see, so obviously it's not just, is it kind of a pull the drawbridge up kind of attitude? Is that what you see?
Well, that's one of the things. I mean, they are not the only people who are trying to pull the drawbridge up, but nevertheless, I suppose, excuse me, a tractor's just going past. It seems more somehow hypocritical when it comes from someone who has directly benefited, because they are here, they have had the benefits of living in this country and all the rights and benefits that has given them, and at the same time they're saying nobody else should have what I've had. And to me, I guess hypocrisy is one of the things that particularly upsets me, that people say one thing and do the other, or don't do what they had. And I guess it suddenly occurred to me that all these people who were making all these statements were the ones, who on their own had had that positive treatment given to them.
Yeah. I should just add that we are, for those who missed this at the beginning, I put a message on the chat function that I'll be fielding questions that you might have for Barbara via the chat. So if you have something you want to share or some question for her, then if you can post it there, and then I'll pick it up a bit later on when we get to that section of the event. But of course, just to finish that last conversation, of course, you've been working very closely for a number of years with Lord Dubs, of course, who was himself a Kint, saved by your father, and Safe Passage. Have they been able in any way do you see them making inroads into government policy, having some kind of influence on things? I mean, obviously the number of people who have been able to come versus the number that was originally granted or allowed by government is obviously much lower, particularly on the family reunions. So how can they sort of improve that number? How can government be persuaded to do more?
Well, I really admire all these people who are lobbying and continuously fighting. I mean, Alf is extraordinary that he just keeps going against all the knockbacks that he gets. All these people who are so lovely and charming and chummy to him in private, who then in Parliament do the opposite of what they've suggested that is the right thing maybe to do. And I think it's a very hard world, lobbying government to do the right thing. But I think Safe Passage, who, as you say, I've supported them because in a sense what they're doing is so important, and it fills this niche of helping to make sure that safe and legal routes exist and that they continue to exist. And Alf has been successful. He got an amendment to the immigration bill through in 2016. This allowed for the Dubs Amendment that probably a lot of people are aware, which allowed for unaccompanied child refugees who were already in Europe to be allowed to come to the UK. And this was quite a breakthrough. And this was achieved really by the fact that the government began to believe that the public really supported this. And in the end, he always believes that public pressure is the solution to getting governments to change their mind. I wish I was quite as optimistic as he was, as he is. And but again, many of the ways that children have been allowed to come to the UK, there are these safe legal routes, and they're being closed off now. In fact, they are both being closed off. So the Dubs Amendment has been filled at an arbitrary number of 480 children. And the other way that children can come from Europe is through something called the Dublin III Agreement, which is a Europe-wide agreement which allows people to move from the country they arrived in into a country where they have a reason to go to instead. And the reason that many children have to move to Britain is because they have family members here. And that has been allowed through this Europe-wide amendment. And that was included in the withdrawal agreement between Britain and the EU. But in January, the government took it out of the withdrawal agreement. And so in 5 months' time, there will be no legal route at all for children to come to the UK. And though the government say, yeah, we're going to negotiate this with the EU, from Alf's point of view and mine, and also the fact that trusting this government seems like a leap of faith, a real leap of faith, wow. The fact is that using children's rights to join their family as some kind of bargaining chip seems like, I don't know, not a very moral stance to take. So the work of Safe Passage at the moment is very much focused on maintaining this family reunion ability, either by getting the government to put it back in the withdrawal agreement, or to getting them to add it to the immigration bill that's going through Parliament at the moment. And that's where a lot of Alf's work is featured at the moment in that area.
Yeah, I just wondered whether Brexit is a bit of a smokescreen to all this, though, because obviously there's a higher politics at stake in the negotiation with Europe and the withdrawal bill. But whether this attitude would have existed anyway, if you go back before the 5 years, or if the result had been different with a referendum, would government still be, or this is the unknown conundrum question, would it still be having this attitude?
Well, what was happening before was that there was this ability for children to claim family reunion, but that didn't mean that they got it. There could be a child in Greece with a family member in the UK. That child has a mandatory right to be allowed to come to the UK to be with their family. But it didn't necessarily happen because the structure itself was so difficult and the government's using it was so unable to make it function that it would take months and even years even to go through a system that was supposed to work. So yes, we're trying to get back to something that wasn't working very well anyway, but at least existed as a way of giving people a chance to make that journey. And what are they doing without that chance? Well, they're getting into dinghies and crossing the channel. And our government believes the answer to that is to put warships in the channel, not to make safe and legal routes so that people can apply legally while they're in another country in Europe.
But of course, there are people that would say that this extends beyond the British borders, beyond Britain, if this is a European phenomenon, with the migrants coming from North Africa or from the Middle East fleeing persecution. So do you see this also as a failure of Europe as a continent, or the European Union? We're looking at it, of course, through the lens of what happens here, but is this problem writ large in Europe?
Absolutely. I mean, it's writ large across the world.
Just because they're flooding to Europe, yeah.
Well, they're not. That's the point. I mean, if you look at the UNHCR, anybody who's interested in refugees across the world, look at the UNHCR website, and it tells you how many refugees there are in the world. There's something like 79 million people who are displaced from their homes, 29 million who are considered refugees, which means they've actually fled from their own country. And most of them are living in the country next door to the one they fled from. And the countries that host the most refugees in the world are not in Europe, by and large. Turkey is number one. You know, African countries are full of many hundreds of thousands of refugees from neighboring countries. So taking a global look, the numbers coming across to Europe and then coming on to England is not the main pressure points in a sense. But it's the way we're perceiving it, as each individual country needs to deal with it individually, when actually this is a global problem that needs dealing with globally. And unfortunately, the UN doesn't seem to have the power and influence that it would be much better globally if it did have, to resolve these problems on a worldwide scale, rather than each country arbitrarily making its decisions. I mean, we're not the worst. We obviously complain about our government and what they are doing or not doing. You know, we have accepted 20,000 Syrians on the Vulnerable Persons Resettlement Scheme from the Middle East. And there are countries, particularly in Eastern Europe, you know, obviously I'm very attached to the Czech Republic and Slovakia because I know many of the children who came from there, and I know many people over in those countries, and they are unwilling to take refugees at all. So, you know, we may be bad, but we're certainly not the worst. And when the EU tried to produce a quota scheme to take the pressure off Greece, Spain, Italy, you know, some countries wouldn't accept anybody. So it does need a much bigger way of resolving it, but one that each country will accept and will play their part in. And I think that's the crunch. How does one get people to see that refugees are you know, they need to help refugees as well. Why should it be our problem? Just like in 1939, people, you know, the Americans said, this isn't our problem. And, you know, my father, one of the things he did was he wrote to President Roosevelt saying, because he didn't think Britain could take enough children. They had so many on the lists. And he didn't think that he was going to be able to get the numbers that they had on their lists. I think they had about 5,000 names on their lists of parents who wanted their children taken out to safety. So he wrote to President Roosevelt, and in the archives that we have, you know, there are responses from the American Embassy in the UK and various groups who the letter was passed on to, saying, well, you know, we can't do anything at the moment and blah, blah, blah. So it is a global problem, and it always has been. But how does one help people to recognize that anybody could be a refugee? You know, it could be you, it could be me. It's an accident of birth, and it's you know, to do with the politics going on in the world. And why do we not have empathy for people in those conditions, or why do not enough people have empathy for people in those conditions?
What did your father make of the state of the world? I mean, he'd seen, obviously in a long life anyway, but that period from the Second World War through Cold War, through end of Cold War, and then the beginning of the refugee crisis, just around more recent years.
He was a socialist, you know. He became a socialist in his 20s. He knew many of the idealists in the Labour Party in the 1930s. In the archives that I'm cataloguing at the moment of all my father's papers, I have a couple of letters from Aneurin Bevan to my dad, and one from Tom Dryburgh. So he was very much of that persuasion at that time. And as his life went on, he didn't really change that much, though he didn't stick with the Labour Party throughout, I have to say. But I guess he was, to some degree, an optimist. He always saw the good side in people. The sad thing, as he got very much older, certainly as he got in his hundreds, was that he became much more of a pessimist, and he looked at the state of the world and seemed very pessimistic about what was happening in the way people behaved. And I think one of the things he complained about most was the lack of ethical behavior, because I guess for a long period of his life and a long period of our history, even if people didn't behave morally, the overwhelming sense was that if you didn't behave morally, then you are out. And what happens now? You know, people don't even apologize, let alone they're out. And I think he found that really hard to get his head around, that there was no kind of moral compass that was the bedrock that guides the way society functions, that it's everyone for themselves and not caring about the others. And I think that depressed him enormously. I was sad to see it happen.
Would it, I want to put words in your mouth, would it be true then that he would have found it hard to follow his own maxim about if it's not impossible? Was that something, would he have always looked for a obviously he looked for a constructive way, he was a solution person because obviously he achieved what he achieved, but did he find it harder to stick with that principle, that philosophy?
I think he did. I think he continued to look for solutions. I mean, he was an interesting mixture, because he was quite, what's the word? He was quite kind of happy to see people in authority and to have an authority that kind of functioned. But when it suited him, he ignored it. So he was someone who said, yes, you know, let's all play by the rules. Oh, in this case, I don't think the rules are going to apply because they're not going to allow me to achieve my aims. So he was a bit of a mixture in that case. It was a bit confusing as his daughter to, you know, be told that these are the rules and then discover that actually the rules didn't always apply because they got in the way of being effective. And I think his view was that if you felt that what you were doing was the right thing to do, that it had a moral basis, that it involved in something that helped mankind or helped individual people, then rules that stopped that were rather ridiculous. And he didn't set out to break rules when he did the Kindertransport, but if rules made life difficult, then he was happy to push at the edges of them and bend them a little and you know, get the job done. So he was a bit of a mixture, but that was how he was effective. And when I give talks about him to schools, I can often see the headmaster or headmistress looking slightly aghast when I say to the children, you know, this is how he behaved. He didn't always listen to authority. He did what he believed to be right. And they all going, oh God, please don't say this. Yeah. But it was true. And I think we need people who stand by their principles and do what they believe to be right. The point about what my father did was that he didn't know at the time, you know, he didn't have the benefit of hindsight. He didn't know that if he didn't do what he did, what was going to happen to these people. He suspected that things were going to get pretty rough, but nobody knew what was going to happen. So he acted based on what he saw at the time, which was people living in atrocious conditions in refugee camps. They didn't know where they were going to end up. They weren't getting education. They weren't getting enough to eat. And it didn't look like they had much of a future where they were. He didn't set out to organize the Kindertransport because he thought all the people that he was meeting were going to be murdered, because nobody knew that. So that's where I think the comparison with today stands up. Not that the political situation was identical, or the groups who are under pressure are identical, but the fact that just looking at it as it stands today, the situation that many of these refugees are living in and are dealing with are absolutely intolerable. And if we now look at what my father did and say that was right, then helping those refugees today must also be right, because it's identical in terms of the conditions that they're living in and the situations that they're facing. So that's my perspective.
It seems, when I'm reading back about how he achieved this, about the logistics, about, of course, the history was that he was encouraged to go to Prague. A friend, a headmaster, I believe, a schoolmaster, was there taking a group, and then came back to London and lobbied the Home Office. It seems amazingly straightforward. I mean, I want to simplify this because obviously the conditions at the time, the circumstances, but it's even more remarkable to think that he did that against the backdrop of impending war and managed to get the permission from the government, albeit with the conditions about placing the families and the guarantee. But to have achieved that, and again, he's very quick to give recognition to Doreen Warriner and Trevor Chadwick, who again we'll mention a bit later. But a small number of people working against the clock to achieve that kind of success, that kind of achievement, is extraordinary. It's extraordinary to have done that.
Yes, I think you're right. I think it was. And I mean, one of the things was obviously the government, the Home Office said to him that he had to find a foster family for each child before they were allowed to come, which was what differentiated the Czech Kindertransport or the Czechoslovak Kindertransport from the German and Austrian one, where many of them came in large numbers, and it was only when they got to the UK that they were kind of found foster families. He was told each child had to have that in place before they were allowed to be given their visa, entry visa. And so these families had to be assessed quite quickly. And when you think of the assessment today for a foster family, it's quite rigorous. And at the same time, if you apply to be a foster carer, you will get a certain amount of money to pay for looking after that foster child. Well, none of the families who took children in 1939 were paid to look after the foster child. In fact, many of them were quite poor and had so little space and finance that they sent their own children to other family members so they could take in a child. So there are, big differences in the situation. And yet, if we look at the humanitarian situation, I think that's the same. And that's what I'm kind of keen to follow up, because, people say, well, we can't take everybody. And I think, well, no, we can't take everybody, but we can stop demonizing the group as if, that is, how do we make it so that we don't have to take everybody or even anybody? Well, let's make it seem like this group is somehow undeserving. And I think if we stop demonizing this group and then decided how many we could help, that we can help more than we are at the moment, but we can't help everybody, I think that would be a huge step forward in humanizing the situation and humanizing our politics, which is so unpleasant at the moment.
Yeah, but I guess because of the detractors, people who are on the other side of the argument, who would say, well, there are many more than 10,000 people wanting to come or fleeing persecution today. So how many is realistic for Britain or an individual country to take? I mean, how do you deal with, what's your response when people say, well, yes, but there is a limit to what we can do?
Well, I think every country thinks they take more than their fair share. You know, the people who are naysayers think that, but actually Britain takes a much smaller number than many of the other major European countries. There are many more people claiming, refugees claiming asylum in Germany and France than there are in Britain. And when people do get to Britain and they have their asylum claim checked, quite a high proportion are accepted, which goes to show that those who come are people who are really being persecuted. You know, the idea that most of the illegals coming to this country are economic migrants, I'm not sure is the case at the moment. I mean, obviously there are economic migrants, but that's not who we're talking about and who we're focusing on. And so, you know, across the world, the percentage of refugees who come to the UK is pretty tiny. I think it's about 1%. And so I think people like Alf and me, we don't want every refugee in the world to come to Britain or to have the right to come to Britain, but we feel that we should be doing our share at the very least. That, you know, we may not at the moment seem like a very successful country, but compared to most countries of the world, we are quite a well-off country. And part of the Universal Human Rights Declaration is about helping people in need, and playing our part in that would seem to be the right thing to do.
I forgot to mention earlier when we talked about safe passage, one of the things that a number of Kinder have done, conscious Sarah Rice on the call, but Dame Stephanie Shirley and Lord Dubs himself were keen to give the reparation that they were given in the last 18 months or so, which came from the Claims Conference and the German government, to donate onwards to Safe Passage that award as a recognition of the sort of future work to support child refugees fleeing persecution. So it's kind of like this full circle work continuing. The amount is €2,500, which again kind of loosely translates back at one point to the amount the guarantee was when the Kinder were coming from Czechoslovakia.
I've never thought of that before. That's fascinating. Yes.
So there's a sort of circular symbolism with that.
One of the things that I think has been something that I have felt the most inspired by is the fact that so many of the Kinder that I know have been involved in the Safe Passage campaign. A couple of years ago, when it was the 80th anniversary of the Kinder, or the beginning of the 80th anniversary of the Kinder Transport, Safe Passage did a campaign called 80 Years On, It's Our Turn. And many of the Kinder joined that campaign and spoke out at many different events. Of course, the government was very keen to celebrate this anniversary of the tolerance and benevolence of the British government. And I was able to witness with immense pleasure.
I know where you're going with this one. Yeah.
Vera Schaufeld, who is, maybe here, hello Vera if you are, tiny lady who this government minister came up to oh, hello, how nice to meet you. And she said, what are you doing about child refugees? And I just thought, yes, this is, how can anybody turn down someone who's got that history? How can they not take notice of someone who has contributed so much to this country just by their presence and what they've done, who understands through every fibre of their body what it's like to be in that position as a child refugee. And, it was just so wonderful to have them as part of the thing. They were the moral authority in that campaign. And I went with Leslie Brent, who sadly died very recently, to lobby a government Secretary of State, in fact. And, you know, I did most of the waffling and the demands, but the fact that he was there meant that we had to be taken seriously. And I was just so, I don't know, inspired and thrilled by the impact and the input of those people in the campaign. And I hope that, you know, the majority of people who have come as refugees in the past feel strongly that refugees today should be helped in the same way, especially when we see, you know, when the British public sees what refugees in the past have brought to this country. I mean, they're amazing people. The courage and the strength and the fortitude that they have and they've shown through their lives is tremendous.
I thought just before you were going to talk about the minister who had the unenviable task of standing in the crowd at Friend's house for that event.
Yes.
And try to talk about or justify the government's response or actions or inactions on this. That was a tough crowd for her. I felt for her that day. I think in the end that the contact that was made between her and Alf and Safe Passage was very helpful. Yes, it was difficult because she was face to face with the reality of the situation. Not only were there about 400 Kinder and their descendants in that, 450 I think, in that audience, there was several hundred of today's refugees in that audience as well. So yes, for her as immigration minister, it was coming face to face with reality, I think, which is if you don't meet people who are the people you are acting on behalf of or acting to prevent, it's very easy to deal with. And I think that's another factor, that many people have never met a refugee. They don't know what it means. They haven't looked in somebody's eyes and heard their story. And that's why I believe that listening to the Kinder, listening to today's refugees, allowing them to speak and to tell their story is the most powerful thing that can happen. It's certainly how I learned what being a refugee is like, by talking to the Kinder, and it's what drew me into the whole campaigning today, because once you understand, how can you turn away? We do have a couple of questions or comments on the chat, so if you did want to add something, then please use the chat function at the bottom of the screen. I'll get to a couple of questions in a moment. I did touch earlier on Doreen Warriner and Trevor Chadwick. I just want to touch on them as well, because you talk about what persuading and raising awareness, but of course their role in the operation was critical, and yet the popularity, if that's the word, or the awareness of your father's work really came from the Esther Rantzen show, famously, and it was very nice to see her at the event with Theresa May before she became Prime Minister, I might add, was there, but she did that again, where she asked people to stand up again, those descendants who had been saved, or whose lives owed their lives to Sir Nicholas. Recently, there was a plaque unveiled for Doreen Warriner, and there's now a campaign for recognition to put up a statue for Trevor Chadwick. But in this sort of this awareness, the scope of history, they're not known as much. And why do you have a view as to why their roles are not so well known? Or I mean, in our circles,
absolutely,
they are.
I mean, they weren't alive when the story became public, and it's as simple as that. I'm sure if Trevor had been alive, I mean, he sounded like the most extraordinary character, a gregarious, outgoing. I'm sure he would have been the centre of attention if he had been alive to be interviewed. But the fact was, when this story became public, it was 1988, and both he and Doreen had been dead for some time. The only other kind of quite intrinsic character who was still alive at the time was Bill Barazetti, who was an assistant to Doreen in Prague and a refugee himself. and he was given the righteous Gentile honor at Yad Vashem, and given quite a lot of attention as well. But I've learned a lot about the media and how it works through being with my father for some of the times since the story came out. And the fact is that they want an individual. They want to focus on one person. They want to either big them up or drag them down, and they don't want to make the story too complicated. And however much he would say, well, I didn't do it on my own, Trevor was the one in Prague who was in danger, as was Doreen. You know, those bits get cut out because that's not the narrative they want to demonstrate. They want to demonstrate there was one person, he was incredibly heroic, his life was in danger, and he did this work. And however much my father protested that it wasn't like that at all, that was the narrative that came through again and again. And part of the reason why I wrote his biography was because we got so fed up with reading all this nonsense all the time that I thought, well, at least if we can put down what we believe to be the truth in one place, then at least it's there if anybody decides they want to actually look. But absolutely, Trevor was, I mean, it couldn't have been done without him because my father couldn't be in two places at once. And the work that Doreen did to get out the families and the endangered politicians, particularly, who had fled from the Sudetenland, and she got them out through Poland. I mean, without them, that wouldn't have happened. So, yeah. And there were many others. I mean, these are, again, just single people. You know, there were a good dozen others who could be, you know, who were also involved and played their part. You know, Czech women particularly, Quaker women particularly, Eleanor Rathbone, the independent MP, the Reverend Rosalind Lee, the Unitarian minister. They all rallied their troops and spoke to the newspapers and spoke in Parliament and did their bit to make things happen. So it was a group effort, and it always has to be a group effort.
I just wanted to, I mean, yes, he sounds like an extraordinary man, Trevor Chadwick, negotiating with the Gestapo and making deals and negotiating. That was some incredible efforts. Just to capture a couple of questions people have sent on the chat. Something which I had already looked into was, of course, you did a red box column in the Times. At the time, Theresa May resigned as Prime Minister and then, of course, invoked, is that the word, or cited your father in her resignation speech. I mean, you pretty much said it all in your column, what you thought about that, but perhaps not everybody here read that. I can see you're smiling by the reaction. Your reaction to that. How did you feel at the time when that went?
I felt a bit mean about it, really, because she said I mean, he used to harangue her. I mean, not harangue her, but talk to her fairly often. She was his MP in Maidenhead. They met up quite a lot. She came to his birthday parties. She was a great fan of his. However, you know, she was Home Secretary and set up the hostile environment during all that time that she was a great fan of his. And yet he did talk to her about, you know, doing things in an ethical way, and he talked about compromise. So when she resigned and said, you know, she believed in compromise, and that's what she thought she had done with her Brexit deal, and this had come from Nicholas Winton, I thought, well, in a sense, that's fair enough. He mentioned it to her in the context of the coalition government in 2010, that a coalition is not necessarily a bad thing because it's about compromise. Not that it was a compromise, it was a walkover, wasn't it? But nevertheless, that was the context of that. But, you know, when you have a campaign, you have to take the moment you can. And so rather than go, yes, Theresa May, what you said is great, and isn't it nice you mentioned my dad? I had to use the occasion because it was a moment of attention on this relationship to point out that, you know, despite the nice things she was saying about my father, she was not doing what, you know, he would have wanted her to do in relation to refugees. And Alf certainly had a go at her about it at the same time. So it's a difficult one. I find it difficult to be too confrontational, but at the same time, you've got to get your point across. And if quiet words don't do it, then you have to try another way.
One of the things that people working in this field, if I can put it like that, get very concerned about is equivocation between the Holocaust and other experiences of persecution and genocide, and how this fits into the whole narrative in history when you're making comparisons between one set of displacement and another. But there are, when it comes to the persecution or the need to protect people by moving them from one country to another, there are lots of examples to cite. So one of the questions we've had is about the offer of the UK government to 3 million Hong Kong British nationals overseas, passport holders, to come to the UK. So is there like a sense of irony with this, or is there, I mean, because obviously it's British direct connection. How do you see that?
Well, I guess it's the world of realpolitik, isn't it? I mean, this is something they felt they had to do. Whether that offer actually comes to fruition, I think is going to be another matter. I mean, the government have promised many things. With the Dubs amendment, they promised these unaccompanied children in Europe could come to the UK. And they didn't specify a number, but it ended up at 480. It took years to get them to fulfill that pathetic commitment. Alf suggested 3,000. And, they had Safe Passage and all the other organisations who were, finding the right children who were vulnerable and who needed to be brought to safety. The amount of fuss and bother and work they had to do to get each single child to come here under the scheme that the government had accepted was just ludicrous. What a waste of energy and time. So I'll be interested to see if 3 million or whatever Hong Kong people arrive in this country, but somehow I think the government are great at announcing things. It's a very different matter what actually happens. And yes, I mean, I'm not really qualified to say whether that's a good idea or not. Obviously, they've allowed in huge numbers in the past in reference to kind of colonies and so on. But I would like them to have a bit more compassion for people who are in dire needs, a bit more close to home.
Yeah. Have you ever been asked to contribute to the building of resources, curricula on Holocaust education, lots of we're very blessed in this country to have a number of agencies that work in this field, but I suppose particularly on the human rights angle of Holocaust education, learning from what had happened. Have you?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I've occasionally looked over things that people have put together about my dad and pointed out where things weren't as I understood them, to be right. But I don't think I've done anything much more than that. No, I'm not sure I'm an expert in any of these things. I have my position, and I'm not an academic. I am someone who has a particular experience and who has a particular passion, and that I am in a lucky position to be able to ruthlessly use my father's name to sometimes get attention. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But this was something that he did as well, you see. He was sent a letter by George Bush in 2006, which somebody had organised, saying, well done for what you did, blah, blah, blah. And the local newspaper came to interview him about this because it was a great story. And he used that interview to complain about the local council who wouldn't give him some land for an old people's home he wanted to build. So the headline was something like, letter from President Bush, but still no old people's home. So he used his growing fame also to press his issues. And he certainly gave me the blessing to do the same. And so I sometimes have the opportunity, if I happen to be invited to something where there are people in the room who I think might be influential in some way, to kind of put my hand out and say, I'm Barbara Winton, daughter of Nicholas Winton. And they have at least to stop. And when they stop, I then have a little rant and then they run away. Right. But if I didn't say that, if I just said I'm Barbara Bloggs, they'd go, well, not interested, and they wouldn't even stop. So yes, I do feel that I have a particular function, and I'm very happy to talk about the history and to educate people. But my passion is to use that history and that education to remind people that things need doing today, and that life isn't about just looking back. It's about looking today and into the future and saying, what can I do to make a difference? And if you feel passionate about something, here's a story which tells you how some people went about it and how they made a success of it, that we can perhaps learn from today. And that's what I'm into.
Yeah, yeah. I suppose I was just thinking about the growing popularity of teaching the subject of the Holocaust to younger audiences. And so now there are pupils in year 5 and year 6, so 9, 10, 11, and their introduction is typically about Kindertransport.
Yeah.
Because of slightly more sanitized, well, not slightly, it is more sanitized than other aspects, which I'll learn about slightly later on. But this role, this legacy, seems to me to entirely fit with that growing work. And maybe there's a role there. The organisations like the National Holocaust Centre and the Holocaust Educational Trust are increasingly teaching ever younger pupils. Plus, there's the role that an individual person can make, or a group of individuals. It seems to strike me as being an opportunity. I'm conscious as we tick round that an hour has flown by. There are 1 or 2 other little questions that I can get to, but I would like to ask Alex if he can share a couple of pictures of your father. These are taken from the 75th Kinder anniversary reunion, which we held at JFS. So there you can see, and the lady in the background, in the middle of the blue, as Renata Collins, who was one of the Kinder who came from Prague.
And the one on his left is Uta Klein, who's another one of his Kinder.
Okay. So I just remember that there were 1 or 2 famous people there, but the hush that descended on the room when he arrived was unlike when I think we had David Miliband. Not that I'm ever comparing David Miliband with your father, but it was a total different feel when he came in, pushed by, I think, Anita Gross, who's the daughter of another Kind from Czechoslovakia. I suppose the final question I wanted to ask you is, we've talked a lot about it comes back to the title of the book and the individual role and your role here. What is it that your main message to individual people would be today? What is it that the individual woman or man or child can do that can make a difference?
Well, I think the message is, don't wait for somebody else to do it. If you think something needs doing, something you believe in, something that you think is wrong, don't look round and say, well, somebody else should be doing this. That's exactly what my father was told. He was told when he went to the British Committee for Refugees from Czechoslovakia, when he came home from Czechoslovakia and said, I'm going to go to the Home Office and see if I can bring in children. They said, no, don't do that. The movement for the care of children from Germany will eventually include Czechoslovakia in their remit. And if you go separately, you'll only upset the Home Office, and they won't want you to do that. And it'll just make it difficult. And my father's view was, well, that's ridiculous. And so he went and he did it. And I suspect if he hadn't, that many fewer children would have been saved. And so the message of that is, you know, get some like-minded people and have a go. I mean, it's extraordinary what's happening today. We just see the negative, but there are groups out there who have formed, you know, Help Refugees, Safe Passage. There's an organization called Refugees at Home who find people who will host someone who has come to this country and is seeking asylum or is a refugee who doesn't have anywhere to live. And there are just hundreds of groups, and there are hundreds of volunteers out there at this very moment doing their utmost to help refugees. And I don't think we see that enough. We just see all the negatives and all the people complaining about invasions and, you know, how wrong this is and how it's taking my job and my hospital place. And there are thousands of people just like my dad who are doing fantastic things, and maybe in 80 years they'll be getting the applause that he gets now, because when we look back we'll go, God, is that what really happened between 2015 and 2020? There was all this stuff going on, and yet look at these people who did these wonderful things. I don't know, but my belief is that there are thousands of people out there who want to do something good and do something meaningful with their lives, which involves helping other people. And if they want to do it, my message is, do it, have a go. You may not succeed, but you may. And if you make a difference to one person, that's one person whose life has been transformed.
I can't better that as a conclusion. So I think we should stop there. And collectively, thank you very, very much, Barbara, for sharing your thoughts, your wisdom with us, and your passion. It's anyone who knows you, you see it comes across so readily, and the inspiration, and also the link with your father historically. It's wonderful for us as an organisation to have that, and again through our members as well. So thank you very, very much.
My pleasure.
And thank you all for joining us. I tried to capture as many of the questions that came through on chat. Being a mere man, I was trying to look at Barbara, talk to her, and look at the chat at the same time. So I'm not quite sure I achieved many of those things. But we will inevitably, we will carry on, and we will see you hopefully at future events. Please look out for the AJR newsletter with a whole jam-packed full of events and activities, and look on our YouTube channel for recordings of these Zoom events as well, and of course our website. And as I said before, if you know of anyone that can benefit from our services or would like to participate with our events and our activities, then please do let us know. In the meantime, I wish everybody well, stay safe, and see you all again very soon. Thank you.